Welcome again. I'm Brad Grant. I'm the interim chair of the Department of Architecture. And to really welcome the conference today, I've asked the Dean of the College of Engineering and Architecture, Dr. John Anderson, to come and welcome you today. Thank you.
It's okay. No, but seriously, welcome to Howard University. It's really exciting for me to be able to work with Professor Bradford Grant and his colleagues in the Department of Architecture to bring others onto our campus to look at very important problems, such as the ones that you are investigating in this conference. I looked at the sessions this morning, the 3 sessions, and all of them, of course, are very interesting, very timely. And one of the things that is very important in the DNA at Howard University is excellence in truth and service. Our president, Wayne Frederick, is something he repeats over and over. We have the alternative spring break where our students go quite abroad to look at how they can bring their talent and skills and knowledge to bear on communities across the globe for their own benefit. And of course, we always benefit as well. So we really try to speak to this notion of truth and service, and this conference is very much in alignment with that. And so I'm very pleased that we're participating with all of you to look at this important problem. So Howard is a campus that is in the heart of DC. So much of the is here with NGOs, the government, companies, other institutions. And we're constantly trying to, as you can imagine, take it to the next level, to have a greater impact on society, to have our students involved in projects and ideas that will put them in a place where they may work at USAID, where they may be leaders in various organizations that improve the mankind, if you will. So I hope you continue to have a great conference. Welcome to Howard, and we thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry, you have a long list of speakers to go through before you can get into the substance of your discussions today. I'm Vincent Houver. I'm the Chief of Mission here for the International Organization for Migration in Washington. I'd like to start by thanking Dr. John Anderson, the Dean of the College of Engineering and Architecture here at Howard University, for his welcome. I'd like to thank as well Brad Grant and Dahlia Doom from the Department of Architecture for all of their support in organizing and hosting this event in their premises. I'd like to thank the organizing committee consisting of USAID, Habitat for Humanity, Verent Solutions, and especially Julie King and Hilmi from Interaction for all of their work and dedication in putting together this event. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for attending and for your lively participation so far. I heard that yesterday's proceedings went quite well. It's clear that this subject brings significant interest, and there's a lot of commitment and enthusiasm for it. I'll now briefly highlight 3 issues in relation to today's discussions, which are of importance to our organization. My first point is on human mobility and how it relates, in our experience, to housing, land, and property issues throughout the world. Wherever people are displaced, they are faced with the immediate priority of finding somewhere to live away from their homes. This means they need to find land on which to live and shelter or housing in which to live. Beyond shelter, displaced persons need to find water, food, jobs, social networks to connect with for support and assistance. All of these strongly relate to finding land on which they can live safely without fear of eviction. Land tenure will help define the extent to which people can rebuild their lives. Where people can improve their shelters and eventually build houses, they will be one step closer to eventually sustaining themselves, especially when they will be able to continue to benefit from those initial investments. Let's look at this practically. We don't invest in something if we don't think we'll be able to use it in the future. You don't take a rental car to the mechanic. It is not only where they will settle in the future, but also what happened to the lands, their houses and their property at the village or town they came from. If the house has been occupied by someone else while they were displaced, any prospect of return will be negatively affected. My second point is that HLP is dealt with very inconsistently within the humanitarian system. IOM, as you may know, manages shelter and settlement programming in over 50 countries around the world. Part of the assistance we must provide in the implementation of these programs is in relation to land tenure and property rights. However, the reality is that while we employ countless architects, engineers, technical experts, very few within IOM, and I think the humanitarian and development sectors at large, specialize in housing, land, and property. This is a critical shortcoming, and we hope that events such as these may help raise awareness and eventually create more practitioners in this field. As I mentioned, I don't believe this is just an issue for IOM, but tends to apply to the entire humanitarian system. As a matter of example, a dedicated HLP focus is part of the humanitarian planning and programming framework in only 6 humanitarian operational contexts in 2023. A fairly embarrassing figure as compared with the vast amount of humanitarian responses that are active in the world at the moment. And these patterns are fairly similar, I believe, across the recovery and development sectors. It appears that the lack of resourcing for HLP is more due to organizations not asking or prioritizing HLP programming than donors refusing it. Again, I hope that this event can help catalyze support and raise awareness to encourage agencies to ask for HLP support and develop this expertise. Finally, we are very much looking forward to the outcomes and results from this workshop so that we may improve our own business model and do a better job at supporting people on the move, but also prevent evictions, which by definition increase displacement. We at IOM are particularly interested to see how we can maximize the benefit of hosting this conference at Howard University and draw on the vast amount of expertise and knowledge in this field within this university and within the US at large. Clearly, there is a lot we can learn together. I've already mentioned the scale of my own agency's staffing and humanitarian operations. However, the positive impacts of IOM's work on vulnerable people would be far more modest without the support of the agency led by our keynote speaker today. Ms. Sarah Charles is the Assistant Administrator to the U.S. Agency for International Development and leads its Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, one of the world's leaders in provision of humanitarian assistance. As I mentioned, the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance is a critical element of the humanitarian assistance architecture, without which many of our relief and recovery efforts and those of most partners in the humanitarian system could not be sustained. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us. It's an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Dean Anderson. Good morning. And thank you all from Howard University, Interaction, IOM, and all of you that are attending this first ever US conference on housing, land, property in crisis contexts. As Vincent mentioned, my name is Sarah Charles, and I lead the US Agency for International Development's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, or USAID's BHA. For those of you that are not in the humanitarian world, I think we are terrible at proliferating acronyms, and I will do my best to not do that here. But the U.S. is the largest single humanitarian donor, providing life-saving assistance to those surviving natural disasters, conflict, and other crises. And I'm thrilled that we can be a part of this event that allows us to listen and learn from the experiences of our colleagues that are working to save lives here in America, and to share how we work to do the same for the most vulnerable globally. While our work focuses overseas, crisis and conflict know no borders. We have experienced disasters here on our own soil, from wildfires wreaking havoc in California to, of course, the devastating effects of Hurricane Katrina. We know that these disasters do not impact everyone equally, with marginalized communities often most impacted and experiencing the most long-term impacts. Their vulnerabilities are often more marked and compounded in foreign crisis contexts. Disasters caused by natural hazards compose only a portion of global crises that confront housing, land, and property concerns. Imagine that instead of surviving a deadly hurricane, you're living in a war zone. Perhaps your own government is the perpetrator of the conflict, driving you from your home and threatening your personal safety, your job security, your access to food and water. Across all crises, housing, land, and property transects many traditional sectors. HLP is not just a question of providing or restoring safe shelter, but also one of protection, which means helping the most vulnerable and marginalized communities avoid physical and psychological harm, and ensuring that people can access their rights. For example, in many areas where we work, women's HLP needs are disproportionate because of discriminatory land rights and tenure systems, meaning that the most vulnerable have no land or property and are at highest risk of exploitation. At every point of displacement, women and minority communities face barriers to accessing their rights to safe and secure housing. A safe and stable place to live provides disenfranchised and displaced communities the ability to raise children, rebuild a sense of normalcy, and access other critical rights and services. Housing, land, and property rights are fundamental to rebuilding lives and communities. That's why the US government-funded HLP programming sits at the intersection of not just humanitarian shelter, but also protection-focused programs, again, those programs that help people access their rights. It includes legal assistance for both landowners and renters to access necessary documentation or recognition needed to avoid eviction and other threats, and prioritizes responding to the unique HLP needs of different communities in different contexts. For example, we've seen in Ethiopia that members of ethnic minority communities tried to return to their homes after conflict, only to find that their houses were destroyed largely due to their ethnic background. Without access to HLP rights, including compensation or remedies, these communities face encroachment on multiple rights and could not return to normalcy and begin rebuilding their lives. Another example is in Iraq, where renters and non-landowners faced HLP concerns following the territorial defeat of ISIS. Female-headed households, including widows, were and are disproportionately affected by evictions from rental properties and resorted to living in unfinished buildings and informal settlements, which are often in unsafe housing situations. Despite the differing contexts, our work in international contexts has lessons for domestic contexts and vice versa. Identifying and anticipating the needs of the most vulnerable or marginalized and the best ways to reach these communities can pay dividends when the worst happens, and each situation can provide lessons learned. For example, in Nepal, years before the 2015 earthquake that took nearly 10,000 lives, one of our USAID technical experts helped design a program in Kathmandu to set up 70 sites that could be used as hospitals, shelters, and more in the case of a natural disaster. When the earthquake struck, all of these pre-established sites were used to help provide life-saving care to those affected. Across the world, today, the city of Portland, Oregon is currently considering this very same model as part of its land use and disaster preparedness plans, taking lessons learned from earlier USAID programming in Kathmandu. This type of anticipatory action is all the more important as we see the ravages of climate change impact, particularly already vulnerable communities. But HLP has not always been viewed so holistically. Vincent did a great job of outlining this. 2 decades ago, humanitarians often worked in technical silos, and sometimes still do. After a disaster struck, engineers and architects worked together on where and how to build shelters. However, they didn't always take into account the needs of women, for example, who often face discrimination, even exploitation, in interacting with landlords or providing ownership for their land. In separate silos, lawyers and staff working on programming targeting vulnerable and marginalized populations worked to promote the security of tenure, but did not always take into account the locations of shelters and how they could be impacted by future disasters, in some ways doubling down on existing vulnerabilities, where most marginalized communities are often located in the areas that are most vulnerable to disasters. Over the years, USAID has listened and learned, and now uses our voice to break down thematic silos of HLP and to bring in experts who ensure marginalized communities like women, persons with disabilities, LGBTQI+ people, older adults, and Indigenous people are able to voice their concerns and access their rights safely and equitably. And it's important to note that in many of the places where USAID works, marginalized communities are often the majority of the population, sometimes 80% or higher. In other words, a more inclusive approach to HLP allows us to provide life-saving assistance to more people and work to rebuild families and communities. When we link technical efforts, we're able to sort out issues more expeditiously and practically with greater impact. What's really supercharged our response efforts is a better understanding of the local context and the unique nature of each crisis. We know the basics of hurricanes, but one that makes landfall in Haiti is far different than one that makes landfall in the Philippines. For this reason, we increasingly work closely with local organizations that are as diverse as the communities they serve, on the ground long before disaster strikes, and who remain in place after our assistance ends. When we support programs that improve understanding of local property markets, for example, we as a donor organization can help disaster-affected communities make informed decisions about where and how to invest time and effort, and ultimately save lives. This approach goes beyond and above short-term disaster response to help foster long-term change that addresses the wide universe of need. Our approach to HLP must look at a person's needs holistically, not just physical structures, but what they need to be able to routinely access safe and sustainable housing solutions. Are women permitted to own housing or access finance? Is ownership legally documented or rooted in traditional communal mechanisms? Is the area affected by recurrent climate shocks or contaminated with mines and other explosives? In many communities affected by crisis and disaster, many people don't have any legally recognized housing, land, or property rights, meaning they're not recognized by the authorities. This is generally the case in informal or squatter settlements. For example, nearly 20 years ago, USAID began a large-scale program in Kabul, Afghanistan, where an estimated 85% of the population did not possess any documentation of home, land, or property ownership. We worked with local authorities to recognize the right of occupancy of beneficiaries to prevent evictions and potential demolitions. Today, this effort to formalize the informal status of most Kabul residents endures, even as after the large US presence has left Afghanistan. We're also increasingly a climate agency. We've learned from the experience of US-based groups that have incorporated recognition of HLP rights into local level managed retreat efforts aimed at reducing the adverse impacts of sea level rise as just one climate impact. We implemented a version of managed retreat in the Philippines after the devastating Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. By working with local authorities and local communities to plan the resettlement of severely impacted shoreline residents into safer nearby neighborhoods, while maintaining access to the social and economic networks that they relied upon for their survival, many of them as lifelong fishers. We will build on this and similar efforts through engaging with groups in the US and elsewhere to better inform our programs aimed at addressing the increasing impacts of climate change. As you go into the next session, I challenge all of us, whether new to the field or with decades of experience, whether we focus on the US or partners abroad, to take 3 messages with you. First, be an advocate. HLP efforts should not operate in a silo. Advocate for a holistic approach to programming that takes into account the context of all persons' needs, and especially women, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and the many others who may have difficulty attaining rights. Second, listen and learn from local voices. All humanitarian professionals should work to ensure that there are seats at the table for local people who know best their challenges and who are best placed to solve them, but don't always have the resources to do so. And third, understand that HLP can be both a driver and a consequence of conflict. Land disputes can cause crises or result from crisis situations, in armed conflict as well as natural disasters, and particularly when people become displaced and houses or land are destroyed. Leaving HLP issues unaddressed can lead to protracted displacement and prevent communities from finding durable and sustainable long-term solutions. The questions of when conflict, crisis, or disaster will affect populations is not if, but when. Disaster-affected people deserve the dignity and basic human rights of security, personal safety, and continued family and community life, no matter where in the world they live. There's no easy solution or one-size-fits-all approach. These are necessarily very localized solutions that we're looking for. But conferences like these offer us vital opportunities to listen, learn, and grow from each other's experiences so that when disaster strikes, whether here in the US or abroad, we'll be better prepared. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for those remarks. I think your point about advocating for a holistic approach is really something we're trying to accomplish with this conference, bringing together both humanitarian and development organizations, as well as the private sector and academics. So thank you again, Sarah, for those remarks. We are going to move to our next agenda item, which is our opening panel on networks, coalitions, and movements. I'm going to ask Sarah Fuhrman, our moderator, and Madiha to come up. One panelist is just running a little behind, and we are running a little bit early. So Sarah's going to go ahead and get started, and he'll join when he gets here. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie, and good morning, everyone. Nice to see such a big turnout for HLP. As Julie mentioned, my name is Sarah Fuhrman. I'm Interactions Director of Humanitarian Policy. HLP and coalitions are both topics of great personal interest to me. Back in 2017, I was working on the humanitarian response in northern Iraq. You heard Sarah a few minutes ago talking about ISIS taking over large swaths of the country, and then the government of Iraq's efforts to reclaim that territory. It was very clear, as people began returning to their areas of origin, that there were tremendous housing, land, and property challenges, and that we, as humanitarians, were not very well equipped to deal with those. A few years later, I joined Interaction, which is itself a coalition, and saw more about the firsthand challenges of building coalitions and also the opportunities that they bring. So I'm excited to be here and to talk about the nexus of those topics. I'm also excited as a humanitarian to hear more about what my sector can learn from others. And we've got some wonderful people here with us today to discuss those topics. So we have Jim Robinson. Jim is the co-coordinator of the Housing, Land, and Property Area of Responsibility in the Global Protection Cluster. Jim started with the HLP AOR, as it's known, in 2020. The AOR works across clusters and sectors to facilitate a more predictable, accountable, and effective HLP response in humanitarian operations. Before that, Jim spent more than 10 years working with NGOs, research institutions, and international organizations on the connections between HLP rights, conflict, peacebuilding, corruption, shelter, and land. Jim is a mediator, practitioner, and trainer, and has a PhD in law and sociology. His thesis examined mediation processes in response to HLP disputes in several contexts. Jim, unfortunately, is not able to join us today, but we've got some recorded remarks from him that we will be slotting in as we go. I mean, I can do the introduction for both of you too, which is always a fun and slightly nervy experience. Or do you want to introduce yourselves? What's your preference? All right. How about you, Derrek? Should I go ahead and give the...
Sure, I'd prefer.
All right. So after we hear from Jim, we will hear from Madiha Waris Qureshi. Madiha is the Director of Strategic Communications at the Rights and Resources Initiative. RRI is a global coalition of more than 150 organizations that advocates for the land and resource rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant peoples. Madiha has 16 years of experience working in the US and in her native Pakistan, leading strategic communications projects and integrating advocacy with scientific research for global audiences. At RRI, she leads external and coalition-wide communications for their international partners in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, including by training and supporting civil society advocates and activists in impact communications and evidence-based storytelling, helping to take their campaigns and movements for community land rights from local to global platforms. I feel like I could just talk with you about all of that for hours. There's a lot there to unpack. And last but not least, we're joined by Derrek Niec-Williams. Derrek is the Executive Director of Howard University's Campus Planning, Architecture, and Development. He's been with Howard University for, is it nearly 9 years now?
Just about, yeah.
Excellent. And before that, I believe you were a senior project manager with Brailsford and Dunleavy.
You got it.
Wonderful. All right, so first question that I'm going to cue to everyone today is, how do we build networks and coalitions that can advocate on HLP issues? And let's see if we can hear from Jim first.
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction and for the question. I'm really sorry not to be able to be with you in person. It was unavoidable in the end, but I'd really wanted to be there. But at the same time, I'm thankful to the organisers to be able to participate in this way and answer the question around how do we build networks and coalitions that can advocate on HLP issues. Now, I don't have all the answers by any means. I come at this from a humanitarian response perspective, co-coordinating the housing, land and property area of responsibility. And I guess the first question I'd want to think about is, what are the issues and who do they impact? Because, what we're talking about is about people, it's about communities, homes, our livelihoods, connection with place, the environment, people's identities. It's about safe, dignified living. And we know that in our own lives, in terms of how our lives connect to our homes, our housing, our land connection. And our question in the humanitarian space is, how can we support those same elements in the context we work with the people we serve? So from an advocacy perspective, who is our audience for this? Well, we're talking about local leaders, we're talking about government, but we're also talking about donors, about the UN, about INGOs. We're talking about national NGOs, local partners, the private sector, judiciary, policymakers, non-state actors, the communities themselves, that they would know more about their HLP rights and about the work we're trying to do to support them and enable them to realise those rights. And because of this, we have to be looking across our silos. We heard it talked about yesterday in the opening panel. We heard it talked about, I imagine, in your training, and it will be talked about again today. But HLP issues, they cut right across those silos. This is a fundamental thing. HLP is a golden thread right across and through response. We see this in terms of women's experience with HLP rights and other vulnerable groups too. Work to improve their situation has to be done, before crisis in a development context, thinking about preparedness, but also thinking about how we respond to a crisis, what questions do we ask in our analysis, and then the programming we put in place. The same when we look at tenure type, when we're thinking about formal land tenure systems or customary, the work to understand and improve these systems is rooted in that done by development actors and hopefully drawn upon by us in a humanitarian response context, and also then carries on a long time after a crisis may have been transformed and hopefully gone towards some way of resolution. We need each other's expertise. For HLP and land specifically, it's often a root cause of many ongoing, seemingly intractable challenges. We need that longer term lens to understand, to analyse and create possible ways to transform people's situations. We can't each do it on our own, and we have to cut across our different silos and ways of working. And this includes how we advocate, with donors. We want them to take HLP really seriously, to see it as a key part of all good, safe, effective and value for money programming. HLP questions at the root of protection, shelter, CCCM, but also when we're thinking about livelihoods, when we're talking about health and education, where anything that involves buildings, infrastructure and a link to the land in some way. And we need to be better at showing why it matters. For example, in Somalia in 2022, over $4.6 million of investment in infrastructure by communities and by humanitarian actors was lost. It was lost due to forced evictions. And that's because we weren't doing our HLP due diligence properly. We weren't resolving and transforming those relationships and making sure it worked well for those that were affected. And that cost is before you count the human cost of being repeatedly evicted, having to live in terrible conditions. So what do we do to try and advocate on this? How do we build a coordinated platform around this? Well, for the HLP AOR, our role is dual, because we support in humanitarian clusters. We act as a hub for coordination and collaboration in programming in humanitarian operations. So we support 22 operations on technical matters. So, as a backstop when there's technical questions that come up. And for that, we draw on our membership, the expertise in the room there with you, but also online across the world. A wide coalition of policy makers, practitioners, academics, those working in different clusters in different parts of a response, including development, peace and environmental actors as well. And we also support on coordination matters. So how do we coordinate better between ourselves? What can we do to advocate, at a global level with the UN agencies, with other organizations to see change happen? One of the examples is we work with the CCCM cluster. We've developed a toolkit for HLP for them. We also work with the mine action area of responsibility. If you're going to release land and have it cleared from unexploded ordnance, then we need to think about what's going to happen to that land. What does it mean for the people staying on or near it? How does the value of it change? There's clear links between women's vulnerability to gender-based violence and their housing and livelihood situation. One of the ways we're pleased to be responding to some of these challenges is with UN Habitat joining NRC as co-coordinators. So we can include that development and durable solution lens as well as the urban experience and expertise that they bring. So this is an element we're really trying to develop. We work a lot with peer-to-peer, so sharing expertise. If someone has a challenge with evictions in Libya, then we draw on the expertise and the experience of those that have been working in different contexts. How have they coordinated on this? Who have they worked with? What are the key questions they've asked? And how have they overcome some of the challenges that they might face? Of course, context is the key thing, but we can learn a lot from what each other have tried and the innovations that have been developed. We have regular online meetings where we can share this innovation and resources, looking for ways to increase that sense of being a community of practice. This work can be quite lonely. HLP is quite niche. It might be better known, but it's still quite rare to find a network of HLP practitioners in the context in which we might work. So we try and build that sense of community, sharing challenges, but also ways that we've overcome. And as we do that, we see opportunities for advocacy. Connections are made, links are seen. Someone they might join an event and see how HLP matters for their work. That allows us to think about how we can support and work with them more. It all links to how we tell stories about HLP, and we need to tell better stories. We get bogged down sometimes in the three-letter acronyms, the technical jargon. But this is about people's lives, and it's about how people live well and with dignity or how they don't. So we need to find a way to work with others to think about those things. And of course, there can be competition or resources struggles because they are limited, both human and financial. And we need to find a way to kind of get beyond those limits. We have to find a way to make this coalition across the nexus with development, peace, government, private sector. We need to be humanitarians, but with a solutions outlook, planning for our exit. And HLP has to be a local issue. It has to be something we're looking to pass on, not to keep for ourselves as outsiders. And we have to see communities and people, not silos and sectors. The HLPOR is willing to, we need to learn much more. And I really hope we can. And looking forward to hear what ideas come out of this conference this weekend.
It feels like I should say thank you to Jim, even though he's not in the room. So thank you, Jim. And turning that same question to you, Madiha.
So I think before I get into how RRI takes action and builds coalitions and networks, I'd like to talk a little bit about what community land rights mean and why they matter, why we should care about them. So community land rights refer to rights to access, use, manage, and own land that are shared by community, a group of people, typically governed by a local leader. And indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant peoples, together they form 2.5 billion people across the world. And they use, manage, or live on land that occupies half of our planet. A lot of this land is in rural areas. A lot of this land has immense biodiversity, natural resources. These include tropical forests. So land that's really important to the whole world, to our own survival. So unfortunately, though, despite having all this land, the legal rights that these communities have are barely 10% to their lands. So they don't, most of this, the land that they occupy, they use and manage is undocumented. These communities are not recognized by their governments. And that makes them really vulnerable to land grabbing, both by governments and by commercial actors, by corporations that are coming from all over the world to invest in land. So it is a huge problem. I think it matters to all of us, whether we're sitting here in DC or we're in the global south, which is where RRI primarily works. So we work in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And one of the things that we do to advance community land rights is building coalitions and networks and helping. So what we do is we go into areas where communities have already organized. There are movements already in place. What they need is access to policymakers. They need a seat at the table, basically, to be able to voice their concerns, to be able to influence laws that affect their well-being. And that's where we come in. So we believe there's power in numbers, there's power in knowledge, and there's power in access. So just like anything in the world, when people are more organized, when they're armed with evidence to show that, what they're asking for is important or has value for the person that they're asking from. So that, why do land rights matter to corporations, for example? What's the feasibility of having secure land rights in place before you start a massive investment project? So we help these community organizations, rights holders organizations, develop research to show why their rights are important to governments, to different actors, to different stakeholders. We help them organize on a national or regional and even global level. And one example of this is a recent women's organization that we helped establish. So it's a Women in Global South Alliance for land tenure and climate. So this alliance has indigenous and community women leaders from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And these women have been working in their countries for ages. They're strong advocates for land rights, but them coming together and having access to big conferences like the climate conference, the COP that takes place every year, or the UN General Assembly, where their fates are decided by people that are usually very removed from them. So having this global alliance and having now access to these platforms and having a seat at the table and being armed with evidence that shows that women's land rights are critical to managing and governing natural resources. So that's the kind of work that we do in building this coalition. And it took us years to build this alliance. We brought together women from our coalition, from movements, even in countries that we are not in, and we were able to facilitate them to exchange knowledge, to learn from each other, movements in other countries and what others that are more successful have been doing. And then they were able to establish this alliance. And now what they're asking for is more money from donors to directed at women, at indigenous and community women, to be able to take climate action, to be able to participate in this global project that's taking place right now to save the planet, where women often are ignored despite their immense contributions to protecting forests and to protecting nature. So it's basically an alliance that's very focused on increasing climate finance for women. And so that's one example. And I can talk about more examples as we go, but I'll stop here.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I was, if you noticed, frantically scribbling notes because I didn't know that much about community land rights and that it was 2 billion or 2.5 billion. 2.5
billion people.
That's incredible. And also incredible that that's not more commonly known. So thank you for sharing that, and really exciting to hear about the Global Alliance as well.
I'll be happy to share information after the panel about the Global Alliance and some of the other alliances that we formed.
Thank you. And Derrek, last but not least, and coming with a slightly different perspective.
Slightly, but interestingly enough, what was, I think, probably part of why one of my colleagues here asked me to come and speak might be because of some of my background. Because as you all were talking about a lot of these international issues, I'm here to talk about the local factor, but it was just kind of bringing up a lot of things from my childhood because I was raised in the diplomatic service. So I kind of grew up mostly in developing countries, and it'll weave into my response to your question in just a second. But I think HLP, right? It's a pretty far-reaching issue, and I want to frame this in the local context. And I can't ignore the fact that we're here at Howard University and doing that. So please, bear with me on this. But I think first and foremost, the key term crisis is something that is important because I want to frame this in the context of coalition building from the perspective that by definition, it's an event or a period of intense difficulty, which is especially evidenced when it's abrupt or it comes without warning. So the things that come to mind are either human-based or they're like natural disasters, right? So war, right, socioeconomic factors, et cetera. And I'm really here to talk a little bit more about the latter. And so, I do want to highlight maybe a little bit of levity for the morning. I've got my coffee in me. I think it's a Chris Rock joke about traveling to exotic locales, right? This is America. Right? You go to a beautiful tropical paradise, and the beauty of like the resort and the beach that you arrive at makes you forget about all of the abject poverty that you witnessed on the drive from the airport to the resort, right? And so this really resonated with me because growing up in the diplomatic service in developing countries, this was like my everyday walking to school, going to a friend's house, et cetera. The stark contrast between like an American compound where diplomats and foreign, nationals and whatnot are residing in a foreign country are living, right? Like the pool and all the amenities, the backup generators at every house, et cetera, as compared to what you see everywhere else for the most part in the country, in the host nation that we're living in. So, seeing this, it struck me because I would always come back to the United States in the summer and see very much so a contrast to that, right? Here with suburban homes and street lights, power 24 hours a day, water you can drink straight out of the tap. I mean, I remember rush to the hotel, turn the faucet on, drink water out of it. And the reason why I bring all of these things up is that seeing this country today, right, sort of bringing the focus more locally, getting off a plane in San Francisco, for example, and making that drive to wherever your destination is, you see those encampments. You see the very same things that I witnessed abroad, right? And didn't think, with all the propaganda the State Department puts in your mind, that doesn't happen at home, right? But it very much so does. And so that's an extreme example of, folks that are displaced due to socioeconomic factors. And so try to bringing all those things into focus, kind of reference the fact that we're at Howard and the fact that, we have these issues of crises that are really reacted to with resources and catching an earthquake in Haiti or war in Ukraine, et cetera. But quite frankly, here in the District of Columbia, there are longitudinal socioeconomic issues of different disenfranchisement, et cetera, that really intersect with a lot of different factors and are more insidious and quietly crescendo into what is today a crisis and quite frankly really has always been. So you have this idea of housing, land, and property, and it goes all the way back to the extermination, displacement of the native peoples upon which, right, the land that we're standing on right now was stolen from. You have the transatlantic slave trade, you've got bondage, humans as property, right? Like a discussion about housing, land, and property in the District of Columbia over 100 years ago would have included a context of humans as chattel property, for example, right? And so you think about the arc of history, emancipation, Reconstruction, the Jim Crow, the history of segregation, and in particular, elements that were really expertly pulled together by Rothstein in his seminal work, Color of Law, right, with respect to the socioeconomic factors as well as the government institutional convergence that led to a lot of the disenfranchisement and the end result being a disproportionate effect on housing security and housing insecurity for certain demographics within this country. And so again, these were not abrupt things. This is, but it did not come without warning. And so, with respect to coalition building in this context, I think, some of my perspective is peppered by the fact that our president is a medical doctor and a surgeon. And so sort of looking at diagnosing the issue, right, it requires a thorough diagnosis. This isn't just about housing. This isn't just about land. This isn't just about property. This is about a whole host of socioeconomic, cultural, and human issues that intersect to create these outcomes that we have, where there are housing security issues in the district. There's gentrification. There's socioeconomic, and when I say socio and economic, those are two different things that need to converge together in order to solve the problem. And so they're systemic, they're multifaceted issues, and oftentimes they're intentionally obscured, right? So that it's more difficult to diagnose and troubleshoot those issues, especially those issues that are historic. And so the issue with coalition building, I think one of the barriers there, and really an opportunity, is that coalitions typically rally around a pivotal issue, a specific topic, and can be very myopic in their pursuit of that. And so, a coalition, as it were, isn't necessarily an organization as much as it is a group. And so diversity, I think, and variety amongst a number of different organizations that come to sort of holistically address the issues at hand is the only real way that we'll start to solve and unbundle these issues, so that we can actually identify them one by one and then figure out inroads, right, as a group to actually solve some of these problems. But until I think those sort of issues are addressed in that sort of a context, I'm not exactly sure what the solutions are. So I'll get into some of the later questions, but I did want to close my comments with the evidence, I think, that physically, right now, you are hosted within an organization, within a body that I consider to be one such coalition, right? The university in and of itself, right, emergent from the Civil War, was part and parcel to an organization called the Freedmen's Bureau. And what a lot of people don't recognize about the Freedmen's Bureau is its official name was the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands. And so, the very founding organization, right, Oliver Howard, after whom this institution was named, as the executive director and served as the executive director of that organization for its duration. Now, this was an entity that was created out of the War Department, right? This is not, a human rights or a national, an NGO, for example. This is something that was created by the government specifically to address those issues. Freed men and women who had a role in society, right, but one that was not necessarily defined, right? Refugees, recently emancipated peoples, and then the abandoned lands left over in the wake of the Civil War. So interestingly enough, many of those abandoned lands were monetized, liquidated at auction, et cetera, and the proceeds were used to fund the educational activities that the Freedmen's Bureau undertook. They built schools all throughout the South, and some of those monies were used to buy the land upon which we sit. And so the security of that land, the security of tenure that we have here, was actually built off of that organization and built off of those funds and that deliberate social engineering that occurred at a pivotal time in our nation's history, right? And so all the way to today, we still grapple with the sort of the ripple effects of those issues and those decisions that were made. I think again that, just really happy that we're able to host this sort of an organization and this sort of a conference here at Howard University in our nation's capital.
Derrek, I feel like you just took me on a journey through not only many different countries, but also through the history of the US and of DC. So many interesting points there. I live in Silver Spring, and I was taking the bus down Georgia to come here this morning, and just thinking about how much the landscape on Georgia Avenue has changed in the last couple of years. If anyone is not a DC native, then gentrification is very visible in many parts of DC, but particularly for me along Georgia Avenue, as you suddenly see houses and small businesses that had been there for quite a long time turned over, and new shiny condo buildings coming up, as just a very surface example. You mentioned something about how coalitions can be myopic, and I think that's a really important statement that we often gloss over. So if it's okay with you, I want to come back and ask a little bit more about that in the Q&A period. Thank you. So diving into everyone's comments a little bit more, and Madiha, returning to you to start with, what challenges do you face in kind of working as part of a global coalition, and working with other global coalitions that you might not face in local ones, and vice versa. So essentially, I guess at the end of the day, what can the global and the local learn from each other?
I think one of the most important things to understand when running a global coalition is that any kind of broader network is only strong or stronger when the people on the ground, the local advocates, are strengthened. So the stronger those smaller local rights holder-led organizations, the civil society organizations are, the stronger the broader movement for whatever cause that they're fighting for. In case of community land rights, most of the communities that we work in with are in rural areas, and that are very remote, mostly, that have also been ignored, neglected by governments because they're undocumented, partly, and technology access is a huge issue. There's also, because one of the goals of our coalition is to help these local advocates gain access to larger platforms, to policymakers, a lot of times language is another issue. For example, within the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, where we work, there's tens of regional local languages. The government is mostly, it's Francophone, they speak French, but there's a lot of different indigenous communities that have their own language. So language is one issue, technology access is another issue. I mean, we've been trying for years to be creative and to be inclusive. And, like in anything else in the world, the loudest voice in the room that has the most contacts or that has the right language, the right words gets heard, and everybody else kind of, sits quietly in the back of the room. So that's what we try to avoid, even within our internal coalition meetings. It's a big investment to invest in interpreters, to invest in sending a local leader to the closest town, providing them with travel funds so they can go to an internet cafe and have the connection to join a Zoom meeting with the coalition. We do all of those things on a regular basis because we believe investing in inclusion is a long-term, very, very fruitful investment. So that's one challenge. But I think there's also immense opportunity in working with, especially with community organizations, because there is a sense of, because it's collective land rights we're talking about. So they already have this sense of importance to collective well-being. Mm-hmm. So they're not just fighting for themselves. It's not an individual fight. It's fight for the community's survival, for cultural survival, because land is so incredibly important to these communities. Their traditional knowledge that they use to survive on a daily basis. So there is a sense of being part of something bigger. And I think in my role in communications, one thing that we're constantly trying to do is to connect their local issues with the broader global story that we're trying to tell, that community land rights and land rights are important for everybody, for people that are depending on the food that's grown on community lands, investors that are investing in lands and facing conflict and unrest, and that they're trying to mitigate, those conflicts by making sure that they gather free, prior, and informed consent of communities before starting land projects that impact them. So yeah, I mean, I think communications is a powerful tool also to overcome some of these challenges, and just constantly investing in ways to include those voices that are not heard, even within community organizations sometimes.
Yes, definitely. So a couple really good things that I just heard from you. Tell me if I got these right. First is that we have to make sure that the local members of any coalition are strong, and that they are, because if we don't have that firm foundation, the global coalition is never going to reach its full potential. I liked what you said about invest in inclusion, and making sure that even though it is hard sometimes to get that into your budget and maybe sometimes hard to get the donor to pay for it, if you want a truly inclusive coalition, you need to find the funds or the technology or the ways to ensure that you have the interpreters, that you've got the technology for people to really engage. And then this point about kind of storytelling and telling the stories in a way that is authentic and true, but that is also allows people to kind of grab onto that and to understand it. Thank you. Julie, can we hear from Jim? And Jim is going to be talking about what makes housing, land, and property different. What about it presents unique challenges to growing a network or a coalition?
Thanks, Sarah. Good question. So what makes HLP different, or, what are the unique challenges around network creating a coalition? Well, I don't know. Is it unique? I'm not sure, but I think there are two ways of thinking about these questions. So one would be about the substance, the content of housing, land and property. The second is about how we respond to HLP, from within our sectors, our approaches, each with our organizational and sectoral cultures, trying to reach out and across, or maybe not. So on the sort of the substance of HLP, I'd say one of the key factors of housing, land, property is the links with power, politics, often with the root causes of conflict. So, we all know that land and identity are fundamentally linked and often fundamental parts of conflict, crisis, and difficulties that are faced by populations in these situations. And, if we're responding either as humanitarians or within the development sphere or whichever it is, we have to work with those power holders in some way. And that can be very challenging. And that's partly why, it has to cut across our own sectors or clusters or systems that we've created. And this brings, opportunity as well as challenge. There are different ways of working that can really cut through. And HLP, I mentioned earlier, as this golden thread, it can really kind of tie together some of these things that we try and do when we link, humanitarian, transitional and development ways of working, and also thinking about, preparedness and pre-crisis as well. I think, though, within those different approaches, there are some challenges. I think there's awareness sometimes of the other. It might be to do with the language we use, assumptions we make about, terminology, how we see, the humanitarian principles and where we have to compromise or negotiate. What role do we see for the state that might be, and sometimes part of the challenges that we're facing? How do we work with them? In what way do we connect with them? And I think that's a really difficult challenge. I mean, also HLP, as we've heard before, is inherently sort of local. It's and that brings with it opportunity and challenge. And sort of echoing Madiha's point before, we need strong local organisations that we from the outside might be able to support. They're often engaged with the politics, and that's needed, but it can bring some difficulties and some tensions. And then I think there's also the humanitarian system itself. So how we work. There's been lots written and thought about, and lots of challenge around the language we use that's, has colonial roots, that's, the system is racist, that there are these problems at the heart of what we're doing as humanitarians that can really cause extra challenges in terms of how we engage with ideas around land and ownership and legal systems and structures and all of these things. So I think there's some real challenges there as well that we know are being shifted and moved on, and we're called on to respond proactively and positively to those. HLP itself, I think it's seen from the outside, and it'd be interesting to hear the views of those in the room just now. But I think it's seen as complex, legal, technical. It can sometimes seem quite aloof and almost too specialist. Whereas, for me, it's about homes and how we connect to land. It's about really things that we all know are profound parts of our own lives and our own sense of safety and dignity. So it doesn't have to be that, but it often gets put in that way. And I think that is because there often is, a legal perspective there, and the links with the politics and the complexity doesn't always help. It doesn't help itself either in its terminology. I mean, HLP as an acronym is not easy. We're surrounded by these three-letter acronyms, and it makes it, very difficult to penetrate, to feel part of that. And as Abire said yesterday, unlike our colleagues in the development sector, we've got a long way to go in the humanitarian or crisis response sector in terms of the same depth of expertise and learning, the links with the academic sector, the need to further strengthen our capacity, and to see HLP's presence in discussions around careers for lawyers, for urban planners, for those considering humanitarian and disaster specialisms. I think there's also a question around funding. Do we ask donors for funding for HLP? Do we advocate that they hold us and our colleagues accountable to reduce the risk of harm in our programming? Do we ask that they hold us accountable to make sure we know who has rights to access and use the land that we install washed infrastructure on, that we build schools on, that we support agricultural projects on? Do we make sure that we include HLP due diligence processes, the staff time that's required for that, as part of our programming, as part of our monitoring and evaluation? I think there's some work there done, to advocate and to try and build a coalition around that cuts again across, the immediate emergency, thinking about the longer term through that protection lens, asking who's vulnerable and why, and making connections to that longer term programming and outcomes. Yesterday in the panel session, we heard Chuck and Carol talking about cross-bureau projects between USAID and BHA, and that was encouraging. But sometimes it can feel like we're almost fighting different funding streams and arrangements, using our own different language and jargon, different perspectives. And so I think, we need to map that, we need to understand it, and we also need to look at opportunities to reach across and to hear and understand and learn from each other. And how can we as humanitarians make sure our approaches address, both the short-term protection challenges, but they're also rooted in thinking about longer-term and solutions-focused outcomes? We need to be thinking about our exit, about where we go, not how we stay for the long term. And we know that durable solutions, resilience, recovery, these are all about having fair and clearly defined rights to HLP and natural resources. So although there are some unique challenges, it needn't be impossible. Having a safe and secure home is something everyone can identify with. I know I can, I'm sure you all can as well. And HLP links to so many areas of our work. But we must be bold, I think, courageous in reaching beyond our usual partners, beyond business as usual, and we need to take some risks to build those coalitions that we really require. Thanks.
Thanks again to Jim, taking us a little bit more focused into the humanitarian space and how humanitarians deal or do not deal with HLP. Derrek, now taking it back more broadly to this point about coalitions being myopic. I think it's very easy to look around and to see the truth of that statement. If you're trying to bring a big group of people together, then sometimes there's this risk of lowest common denominator issue where you're kind of boiling it down to one thing that everyone can agree on, or sometimes not agree on. And I think white feminism is probably a fantastic example of that. So how do we come together into coalitions? This is just a very small question, and Madiha, actually, if you have points on this, then please jump in as well. But how do we find those issues that we can bring people together on, and not lose sight of differences, and make room for different perspectives and different backgrounds of the people that we're working with, and kind of make space to respect and to honor those differences?
Well, I think it's a pretty simple equation, but it's a complex implementation, right? Because to your point, I mean, the answer to your question is in the question. Like, how do you make space for these people, for, right, the unheard, the underserved at the table? Is you make space, right? But it's not always that easy. And I think, again, I do want to dig in a little bit to that myopic comment, because, and I think with this story, I'm a little bit of a story. So if we have time.
Go for it, yeah.
Right.
I think storytelling is emerging as a bit of a theme here, so go for it.
Yeah. So I'll give an example of sort of a myopic outcome, right? A desire. So many years ago, during the crack cocaine epidemic here in the District of Columbia, actually, there's a little neighborhood right at the doorstep of the university called Detroit Park. And, long history behind Detroit Park, originally a segregated community, ultimately integrated, and became somewhat of the bedroom community of the intelligentsia that served the university. A lot of faculty lived there, close walk to campus, et cetera. And there actually were 2 dormitory buildings located right there in that neighborhood. And during the epidemic, most of the homes in that neighborhood became vacant, houses, et cetera. And just so happened that the university, under the administration of President Xi, was actually acquiring property. So a lot of the property, around here was originally part of the university, but was carved off to make money to build the original buildings that we had. And so he was in this process of buying back some of these assets. And so we, the university, owned, 50 homes in that community, and were accused of being slumlords, right? The institution back, right? Because they were vacant, et cetera. Now, no one would have bought those homes at that time, right? And you sold them at a loss more likely than not. But so talking about a coalition, the university partnered with the community, city, as well as Fannie Mae, right? Raised all this money and rehabilitated all of the homes that we owned in the neighborhood, right? So again, goal of rehabilitating the Detroit Park. It's called the Detroit Park Revitalization Initiative, right? And so the sale of these homes are all sold at a loss, from the total cost of rehabilitation. And they were earmarked specifically for Howard University employees that made under a certain amount. So effectively like an early nascent affordable housing, sort of workforce housing component. And so, it was big fanfare, hugely successful, revitalized the neighborhood, right? Now, today, right, now, and kept the neighborhood diverse, right, as it was at the time, right? And so today, there's one single resident that remains in that neighborhood that's a product of that whole process. All of the other families, they saw, and a product of those houses were maybe in the 150s, 200K-ish, and now those houses are $700,000, $1 million, right? And so, interestingly, by solving that issue, that one issue myopically, like we're going to revitalize, right? Today, right? We, the institution, right, are retroactively being accused of gentrifying that neighborhood. We, Howard University, right? And so again, it's about those unintended consequences, right, of whatever action you take. And that's what I mean by myopic, that not looking at what, you're throwing a pebble in a pond, and you have to look at how those ripples affect the whole ecosystem around, not just, I want to get this rock to the bottom of this pond, and that's my goal, sort of thing. So again, I wanted to shed a little bit more light on that, provide a little context for how coalitions can be built, right? Mm-hmm. And then, I'm not sure if you have comments, but I can keep going, to provide like an example of what we at Howard University right now are doing in this immediate area. Because as it stands, I'm in the real estate side, and we are the owners of a lot of land, right, that right now has higher rents than what you can get in Georgetown in Shaw, right? And so it's very different than it was back in the 1980s when a lot of the land was reacquired by the university. And so what our administration is faced with is we have deferred maintenance on all the buildings that we need. We need to house our students, right? And when I was a student here many years ago, more years ago than I'd like to admit, a couple of students could get together and rent any one of these townhomes around here and live close to campus affordably, have access to amenities, et cetera, and the lifestyle that the students would need to support their academic pursuits, right? Now, that is not a reality. Now you got students going, commuting to campus and whatnot. So housing our students affordably, particularly students that are economically disadvantaged to begin with, right? And many of our students Pell Grant eligible, right, et cetera. So looking at solving these issues, and again, I'm gonna speak about coalition and bring it back to this issue in just a second. So one of the things that we were faced with is that we are developing commercial properties, right? We're developing surface parking lots that we're not using for anything but parking, and we're generating cash so that we can reinvest in the mission, build new facilities, build a new hospital, build a new medical office building, a new health sciences complex, right? The last time that a new academic building was built, I wasn't born yet on this campus, right? So, just to kind of give you the context that one of the important things that we're driving at in all of the real estate development activities that we are realizing is minority participation, inclusion, overall, like throughout the value chain. And so the district requires, for example, CBE participation on projects. A certain percentage of the dollars you're spending overall have to go to local businesses. And again, I'm talking about those broader socioeconomic issues because at the end of the day, access to housing, access to land and property requires capital. And that's not, that doesn't see color, right? It doesn't matter, you know, if you have the right amount of money, you know, in America today, you should be able to get access to whatever housing that you like. But getting to the point where you have that capital, right, that's where the disenfranchisement comes about, because there are certain people in this country that have had a several hundred-year head start on generating that intergenerational wealth. And so looking at these surface parking lots that we're redeveloping, we're not specifically displacing people, right? Like, we're not tearing down Section 8 housing and redeveloping it into condos, right? But at the end of the day, it does create a net effect where you open a Burberry store or, you know, a Ruth's Chris on the block, and all of a sudden, all the business owners are like, well, we can charge more now for our wares, right? And so again, it creates a net effect that does affect people. And so we're engineering not only the CBE requirement, which is, you know, it's the city's minimum requirement. They require 35%. On most of our projects, we're hitting like over 50, some projects 70. I think the peak we hit was 88%. And again, also expanding that conversation, not being myopic about checking that box, but where does the capital come from that's funding a $200 million development, right? Who profits from that? Which investor base is getting the revenue from that? And we have minority equity requirements on all of our deals, where if you come to the table without, you know, and again, we leverage them again. Well, these developers in this proposal, they had a 30% minority participation. They're crowdsourcing and whatever, and they're building wealth within the community and giving inroads and opportunities to do that. In addition, I think affordable housing is an important component. So we're pushing all the developers to realize the maximum, you know, interpretation of what is required by law in the District of Columbia now with inclusionary zoning and IZ Plus to add incremental affordable units. But on top of that, the university is committed to delivering between 50 and 100 affordable housing units at not to exceed 60% of AMI in this area. And so we, the university, are coming out of pocket. There are dollars we could spend on student scholarships, on, you know, all different manner of programs, research, et cetera. We're spending those dollars to subsidize the cost of housing for residents so that people can stay within this community. And again, that's an important element to an institution. And that's why I say, again, if we were looking at this myopically, if we were just real estate developers, right, we would say maximize the revenue, put it in the bank, make your investors happy, move on to the next deal. But again, we're trying to optimize that value and create inroads to value creation within the community. Same goes for retail, for example, where we're looking at potential, you know, collaboration with community organizations to work on retail condos and whatnot, to be able to allow some of the older, you know, historic businesses that have been in business in this area for a long time to remain on the corridor, for example. So all of these sort of things come together in what we're doing as an institution. And that's why I say that this right, like on these four walls we're in right now, which would be a library when I was a student here, this is a coalition. And we are really actively pushing to try and realize not only, you know, well-being in people's lives overall through the human development that we undertake as an educational institution, but also in all of the different mission-oriented objectives that we weave into these activities that we undertake.
Thank you. So, I mean, some really good thoughts there on how do you kind of, how do you broaden the lens and not be so focused on the one issue, but try to have some intentionality around unintended consequences and more than that, knock-on effects. Or if we do X, then what happens over here?
Okay, one more little tidbit. So in our negotiations, let's say, through, like, for example, master planning activities in the district where we're required to engage with the local community. So not only our students, faculty, staff, alumni, et cetera, but also, you know, local residents, property owners within, and special interest groups in the area, right? And so this issue of affordable housing came about. And at the time, there was this protest group on campus, and you know, students come loaded for bear to protest at Howard University, and you know, it happens to be the closest thing to them, so it's easiest to protest with us. So the logo for this organization called HE Resist was the clock tower of the university, right? Independent, you know, the evocative Independence Hall in Philadelphia, with the black power fist that Stokely Carmichael designed at Howard, coming up, cracking the clock tower in half, right? That was their protest logo. So they were all rallied around this issue of gentrification, affordable housing, et cetera. And so was the local community. And so, you know, we bring everybody in a room together. So in each of the echo chambers, you know, you go to Pleasant Plains, LaDroit Park, Shaw, et cetera, you know, Columbia Heights, et cetera. Then you go to the student organizations and whatnot, and these little echo chambers, affordable housing, right? That one term, affordable housing, is important, right? You bring the groups together in what we constructed as a community advisory committee. So rather than the university going to all of these other, cottage little areas, we bring all the leaders together to the university so that everyone's looking at one another, hearing, the reverb from their own echo chambers start to wear off, right? And the issue of affordable housing came up, and the students came in assuming that the community and them were on the same page. We both believe that there needs to be more affordable housing in the area. What can the university, the city, God do to fix this problem, right? Very quickly, we got to realize, especially from the students, that the community wasn't talking about affordable housing that the students could get access to, right? Because the students have driver's licenses from Connecticut and North Carolina, and they're not residents of the District of Columbia, they're temporary residents. And in the eyes of the local residents here, the students may be a little bit part of the problem, but again, they were not the ones who were eligible for that. They weren't displaced, they weren't affected, et cetera. And so very quickly, like that dialogue got really interesting really quick, because again, you had two different groups that were coming in thinking that they were going to be, coalescing together. And quite frankly, they couldn't have been more diametrically opposed in their understanding of the same words. So again, that's a little story that I wanted to share on that note.
Yeah, and good points there around when you are pulling together a coalition, making sure that everyone is singing from the same song sheet, that you are talking about the same thing in the same way, and maybe doing some due diligence ahead of time. Madiha, final words on coalitions, land rights, anything else that's been bubbling up for you in the last couple of minutes?
I think just coming back to the challenges that we all discussed, and we've talked about investment into inclusion, and just coming back to that, and there's this concept in our sector, in the land rights sector, of free, prior, and informed consent. We have an acronym for that. We say FPIC, but that's what it means. It's kind of a universal concept, which to me, just those few words strewn together really outline the biggest challenge for anybody that's invested in this issue of land rights or community land rights, and how to resolve this issue. Because I think it's important to understand that you're not always going to get what you want when you go asking for people's consent, and informed consent, and prior consent, and pre-consent. There's a lot of, each of those words implies investment of time. It requires patience, which a lot of times folks that are looking for quick solutions just don't have that kind of patience. And just one quick example around carbon markets, which is a very contentious issue in our coalition and everywhere else in the world, where communities have very different views of what this burgeoning carbon credits business empire that's building up in the background of climate change in the last few years, and what it means for all these undocumented communities that have been living on and using lands that store carbon. And now all of a sudden there's this business opportunity where carbon credit companies might contact communities directly and say, partner with us. And it's a complicated, I'm not going to go into details of what it means, but it's just one issue that has been contentious in our coalition. And there are times when we just cannot take a position on an issue, and we have to be prepared for that. And carbon is one of those issues where there's just not enough agreement, not enough evidence that what works, what doesn't. We still keep collecting research and publishing research to show that secure community land rights are an important precedent for carbon rights, and kind of generating that terminology. But we refuse to take a position because there are members of our coalition who believe there is an opportunity for communities here there are others that are resolutely against it because they've just faced different impacts. So I think it's important to have the courage to just to take the time to reach agreement. If there's no agreement, to be able to say that there's none, and we need to do more work and to be able to have the patience and time to invest in that, the whole consent business.
Yes. Patience, time, and maybe a bit of humility as well to say, we don't have all the answers right now. We need to do more research. We need to think about this more. Maybe we need to take a step back. Yeah. Well, thank you both. Thank you as well to our remote gym, and thanks to all of you. This has been really fun, and so thank you both for making time to join us today. This was great.
Thank you, Sarah.
So much.
Yep. All right, back to you, Julie.
Okay, we are going to move to our parallel sessions. Thank you to Sarah and our panelists today. For those online, we will be back at 3 p.m. to wrap up and close the conference, so please do join us back here at 3 p.m. Eastern. For everybody here in person, we're going to go into our parallel sessions. So for those that would like to go to the session on imagining ideal HLP responses, you will be upstairs on the first floor in the Silcott Gallery. For those that would like to join the HLP and climate session, you will be right in the back in these glass walls. And for those that would like to join the HLP and gender session, you will be upstairs in room 150. Thanks, everyone.